an appropriate marker for what Tennessee women did all along the way, from the time of the very first Native Americans on up to ratification and right up to today. We have done what we could. Now, here we see the marker in Centennial Park here in Nashville that I'm sure many of you have walked by on several different occasions. You see here this sphere, this marble ball up on top of a large pedestal. And it is a very interesting marker because it is there to remind people of what the women did in the Centennial Exposition, the Women's Committee, which built a woman's building. They had a female architect design the building, and all of the activities there were planned by this committee of women. Now, if you look at this thing very closely, as you see, it has a little plaque there on the south side of the monument facing West End Avenue. You see a plaque that over the years has gotten rather dirty and is very difficult to read. This is the monument to mark the place where the Women's Pavilion, the women's building, was during the Centennial Exhibition in 1897. And it is a lovely marker, but the phrases on it are somewhat enigmatic, especially the first one. Here, as you see, the information about the World's Fair that we held here in Nashville, the Centennial. And then here is this quotation that is very, what my friend Elizabeth Perry, who's now deceased, a historian, said. She said that phrase is an enigmatic aphorism. That is so round cannot be any rounder. What could Mrs. Kirkman, the chair of this commission, have possibly thought when she put that particular phrase on there? And my guess is, you may have your own guess as to what that statement might make, but what she wanted to say was that the building and the activities, the programs, the artwork, all of the design of that building was so close to perfection that it could not be any better than it had been. And then there below there, you see the names of the women who were on the commission. Most of them are listed by their husband's name and not their given names. We have women from Knoxville and Memphis on this board of this exhibit. And it is a group of elite white women. Their husbands had been successful businessmen. Only one of these, Mary Boyce Temple from Knoxville, was a single woman. She was a professional writer, and she was the only one among them that was not married. And then at the bottom, Mrs. Kirkman put a statement that she undoubtedly wrote and is in some ways reminiscent of the speech she gave when the women's building first opened that spring of 1897 about what the vision for this building was. But it's entitled Women's Work. So let me read you what it says there, because it is so difficult to read and to see what the language really actually says down here. Women's work, whatever may be necessary to preserve the home and to ensure the freedom of the state. Now, she had mentioned that phrase, home and freedom of the state, in her opening remarks that summer day, spring day in 1897. Again, what she seemed to be saying here was, yes, women were still responsible for a good bit of activity related to the home and children and the family, but they also had a responsibility to the state to make improvements, to make this a contribution to our way of life here in the United States, our system of government. So here it seems that she is saying the boundaries have been stretched. Now, let me make it pretty clear here. Mrs. Kirkman was not in favor of women's suffrage. Some of these women were, some of them were not. But she really saw that women were expanding their horizons, and that's what she wanted this building to represent and what she wanted it to be remembered for doing. So let's go back to the beginning. Throughout the first part of American history, women were considered in a private sphere, the sphere of domesticity, whereas the public sphere was saved or only confined to men. And women and men did not cross those barriers. There was a very distinct line between them. Women had already begun to stretch those barriers. They had really begun that well before the Civil War. By the time this monument was put up in 1904, there were a lot of organizations already in action. Women's voluntary associations had been organized and were in full force trying to make contributions to bettering our communities and our states. As a matter of fact, there had been so many women's clubs of a variety of sorts by 1916 that the business federation, the Tennessee Federation of Women's Clubs, led by the business and professional women, but also a number of literary societies, music societies, art societies, and other groups, study clubs, were part of this federation. And this book was published in 1916 to show how broad the whole idea of women's work actually was by this particular period of time. Women have always worked in a different way from the way that men worked. Women's work has almost always been communal. Women did not bear their work alone. Women worked together, whether they were farm women or urban women, whether they were factory working women, whether they were enslaved women. They worked together, taking care of the tasks that were before them. They birthed babies together. Women of color also went through these same dramatic things. And this was indeed a very female group of women. And as they worked together, they often talked about what could be done to make our community a better place. Now, these women understood that childbirth for women, no matter what age, no matter what race, often could be fatal. They had made those trips to the various cemeteries across the state. They had seen not only women dying in childbirth, but they had seen women having children, raising those children, and then these children dying of one epidemic or another. These two slides are from the Nashville City Cemetery. And the city cemetery records, the interment records of the cemetery, some people believe that as much as 75% of the people buried there are children and women. So women understood death and they understood life, and they understood that they had to do what they in fact could. And for African American women who were enslaved, imagine the horror of having your baby ripped away from your arms and sold to someone else. This was the horror of all horrors for African American mothers, and it certainly bound them together in a community unlike any other that existed before the Civil War. Now, let's talk for a minute about how women in Tennessee first became involved in public activities, more organized than just your neighbor having a baby or your nephew having the measles and dying. Women began to really organize. The Southern women were not involved in some of the activities that Northern women were, but they did first and foremost have a religious faith and were very active in congregations across the state from the very beginning. Here is the First Presbyterian Church in Knoxville and its historic marker, and you see that it has a cemetery there beside it. And these women did what they could to help. The ministers often called on these women to raise money when the church needed something. They were often called on for one thing or another. Jonesboro had a Methodist church over in East Tennessee. The Methodist ladies there decided that they wanted to send what you might call missionaries, circuit riders, over into West Tennessee in the 1820s. So these women in this church began raising money to send Methodist ministers over into West Tennessee, which was just being settled because the Chickasaws had been pushed out as a result of the War of 1812. So these women were very active raising money and sending out missionaries. Now here in Nashville, the churches were a little slow to get started. You might be surprised to hear that, but most of the people who came here in the original settlers were Scots-Irish Presbyterians, but they were not the first group to found churches here. The Baptists and the Methodists had more success. The Presbyterians were most interested in having a school for their children. They brought a minister in, Thomas Craighead, who started Davidson Academy. It had some fits and starts, but the congregation there at Spring Hill did not really survive very long. So finally in Nashville in 1814, now the time that this church is founded is really kind of ironic because the men in Nashville had gone off to New Orleans with General Jackson to defend New Orleans from the British here at the end of the War of 1812. So finally, a Presbyterian minister comes to town, Gideon Blackburn, and he's finally going to organize this church. They go to the courthouse, they get themselves a charter, and on this Sunday, when they organized the church at the courthouse, there were 7 people in attendance, 1 man and 6 women. The man was described as having great tact, energy, and pertinacity of purpose. This church grew very, very slowly. In the membership records going up to 1818, there were 21 names on this list, but only 2 couples with 17 women as members of this fledgling little congregation. But it is from these churches of all denominations that we see the women beginning to get organized and to look at things within their own communities that they can do to make wherever they live a better place to live. One of the women who was a member of the First Presbyterian Church was Anne Rogers Grundy. She is now buried at the city cemetery along with her husband, Felix Grundy. They had moved to Nashville from Kentucky, where he had been a judge, but they came to Nashville primarily because he was very interested in land speculation, and Nashville seemed to be a hub of opportunity to buy lands further south and further west where cotton could be raised so profitably. So she was a Scots-Irish Presbyterian, and she was a member of the First Presbyterian Church, but she decided, because she had had some experience in Kentucky with a Bible society out of Philadelphia, she decided that she would try to get a Bible society started in Nashville. She partnered with a young Methodist minister, and they began Sunday school. Now, this was really a literacy program more than a religious program, although they certainly did use the Bible to teach reading. But you would think that this would have been very popular with the minister. But as the stories go about Mrs. Grundy's Sunday school here in Nashville, some of the ministers thought this was blasphemy because she was breaking the Sabbath by teaching on Sunday. Now, you know how things go. After a while, the ministers realized that this would bring more people into the congregations. And so within a year, most of the churches in Nashville, which were still very small, had begun Sunday school. The photograph that you see on your screen on your right is a house that Ridley Wills said was one of the greatest tragedies that house was allowed to be torn down. It was the Grundy Mansion. When Felix Grundy died, the Polks bought the house. President Polk never actually lived in the house. It was being renovated during his last year as president in 1848. And when they returned to Nashville, he got sick and died. But Sarah Polk herself lived there for many, many years. She saw Confederate generals, Union generals coming and going through that home throughout the Civil War. Now, the Methodist in Memphis, one of those churches in West Tennessee that was founded thanks to the financial help of the women in Jonesboro, Tennessee. And these women, the people there in that church, understood why the church had been founding to spread the gospel, so to speak, further west. And they too embraced this concept of sending out preachers and sending out people to help other people establish churches. Women worked through their churches, solving problems. They provided the assistance for the sick, the assistance for the grieving, the assistance for orphans. The one thing that they did not run were female schools. And every town in Tennessee that was of any size almost had some kind of female academy. They were generally run by men. The boards of directors were always men. I've never seen the list of a board of directors of a female academy before the Civil War that had women on it. But here we have the National Female Academy, which had a very prestigious board serving under the leadership of the head of school, and it was quite a success and a very highly respected institution. Women were highly educated there. Many of those women became teachers. It was one of the many jewels that Nashville felt merited being called the Athens of the West. Yes, it was the Athens of the West for a good long while. Reverend Philip Lindsley, who had come to be the president of the University of Nashville, had named the city the Athens of the West. That's what he aspired to make that university, and it certainly was. And so here you see some of the young women there who were students at the Nashville Female Academy, which stayed open until the Civil War and the occupation of Nashville, and it did not reopen after the Civil War. Now, women were not particularly interested in running a school, but what they were interested in was helping other women who needed assistance. And so one of the things that women from several different church denominations and congregations decided to do was to found a place to create a boarding house, if you will, that they call the Protestant House of Industry. And they would provide lodging and safety for young women who came into the city of Nashville without any means of support, no family, and they provided security, educational services to some degree, and even some job training. Obviously, there were no real jobs for females in Nashville. Slaves did almost all of the domestic work in people's houses. Enslaved women and men did domestic work, yard work, and other work. Women had no opportunities for other kinds of jobs. Women were not teachers unless they decided to start a school within their own home, which the O'Brien sisters, Martha O'Brien and her sister, did. But by and large, this was a place where women could be safe and could work, could find a way to work. This is the forerunner of the YWCA, which was founded in the 1890s. There is the list of the women who were on the board of this institution. As you see, we've got all denominations there. There was a Catholic presence in Davidson County at this time. The Catholic women chose not to participate in this. You know, we think of segregation in terms of race, but segregation was also along religious lines, and Christians did not socialize or interact much with Catholics or Jews. So the lines of segregation were many and very complex here. The Civil War had been coming for a long time. Nashville knew it, Tennessee knew it. East Tennessee was very strongly Unionist. West Tennessee, very strongly secession and for the Confederacy. And Middle Tennessee was right in the middle, with families who were very ardent Union supporters seeing their sons enlist in the Confederate Army. So here we have one turning point in bringing women out of that private sphere, because when the males of the community and the family leave home, women have to pick up the work. And across the state, whether they were Unionist or Confederate supporters, they saw the tasks that they had to do. Before Tennessee even seceded from the Union, Memphis women, under the leadership of Sally Chapman Gordon Law, had formed an organization called Southern Mothers. What their job was to make uniforms for a Confederate Army, even though Tennessee had voted, at least in February, not to even talk about secession. And they had founded themselves before Lincoln was even sworn in as president. So they anticipated the war. And when Tennessee did secede in June of 1861, they continued all of the work they were doing, even when the Union Army came in the summer of 1862 and occupied the city of Women. So these Southern women began operating hospitals in their own homes. The Battle of Shiloh took place in April before Memphis fell to the Union Army, and the wounded from the Battle of Shiloh were brought to Memphis for care. And these women offered their homes freely and took in whatever soldiers needed to be taken in and taken care of. They were very devoted to this cause. Here in Nashville, we had another woman, Caroline Meriwether Goodlett, who did pretty much the same thing. She offered sewing circles. She and there were several different groups of women who were working together to provide food for the Confederate soldiers because food was in such supply. And as a result of her efforts, after the Civil War, as these women began to think, Confederate women began to think about the dead Confederates and how they are to be treated in history, they began raising money for monuments and putting monuments in varieties of cemeteries across the South. If you go to almost any courthouse in any southern city, you will see a statue that looks somewhat like this one. The town I grew up in Texas, Bonham, Texas, had a Confederate statue, not unlike this one, on the lawn of the courthouse there. This book is one of my prized possessions. It was given to me by one of my friends, Margaret Douglas Wheeler, several years ago, as she and her mother and sister were cleaning out a family home over in West Tennessee. It's a small little book, but it was one of the things that Southern women did after the Civil War to begin making some sense out of the war, at least what you might call controlling the story and the way it was taught in schools. So a Nashville woman, Mrs. Ann E. Snyder, wrote this history book, The Civil War from a Southern Standpoint. And it is a gem, as you can imagine. It refers longingly to the glorious days and the great civilization that existed in the South. That was a common use of language, that the South had this magnificent civilization that had been destroyed by the Civil War. Women in Memphis are also doing some of these very same things. Elizabeth Fisher Johnson was taking up to some degree where the women in Middle Tennessee had founded the Protestant House of Industry, and she brings women in Memphis together after the Civil War. They will found a women's Christian association, another one of these forerunners to the Memphis YWCA. She became very active in the temperance movement. Many Tennessee women, all of the counties in Tennessee had robust temperance societies, especially when the Women's Christian Temperance Union became really active under the leadership of Frances Willard. So Elizabeth Fisher Johnson became active in helping women. And why were women so interested in temperance? Primarily, they saw it as home protection. They felt that a lot of domestic violence, the great majority of domestic violence, as a matter of fact, had been committed by people who had had too much to drink. And that was what they were trying to stop and trying to prevent happening by calling for not just temperance and limiting alcohol, but complete prohibition. Women in Memphis also found this organization, the Oliver Refuge, which was founded by women, run by women, and it was similar to the House of Industry or the YWCA, but it was for girls who were in trouble. This meant either they had been arrested for prostitution or they were pregnant and not married. So this became a sort of a unwed mother's home, but women were helping women here in Memphis with problems that they saw were distinctly women's problems. The women in Memphis took the next step, which was founding the Women's Christian Association. And this building looks remarkably like YWCA's across the country, but it was founded in Memphis before the YWCA was founded there or in Nashville, to provide a place for women to find, single women to find lodging while they worked in town. By 1887 and moving towards the next century, we see the typewriter coming on the horizon. And the typewriter changes women's work dramatically, simply because women were never secretaries. A secretary was an apprentice to the male, the accountant, the lawyer. The secretary had beautiful handwriting and wrote by hand, but with the QWERTY keyboard on a typewriter, many men's fingers were just too big to absolutely type well on that keyboard. And so secretarial positions became a female job and women came into the workplace. Also, as urban areas like Nashville, Memphis, Knoxville, and now Chattanooga began to have a robust retail community in the center of their cities, you will see women clerks in these stores that you had not seen, where you had not seen stores or women's clerks prior to that. So they also, in addition to providing a residence, they offered here a hotel where traveling women could stay if they were traveling from one point to another. The largest of all the organizations in Tennessee was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. I'm the first to admit that historians don't really quite know how to treat this organization. It was far, far, far bigger than any of the suffrage organizations that were founded. Even suffrage at its height in 1920 only had a small fraction of the number of women members, period, that the WCTU had. The WCTU had leadership, and that leadership understood how to get their message across. The national leader, as I mentioned, was Frances Willard, and here in Tennessee, the leader eventually became this woman right here, Selena Holman, from Fayetteville, Tennessee, a doctor's wife, several children. She was interested in the cause of prohibition. And they began to work throughout the 1880s and 90s. They tried to get the General Assembly to make it harder and harder to purchase alcohol. The 4-mile law, which they pushed and pushed for, they were very active. This organization, for many religious denominations, was acceptable for women to participate in. The only denomination that I'm really aware of that was opposed to women participating in the Women's Christian Temperance Union was the Churches of Christ. David Lipscomb, the editor of the Gospel Advocate, the newspaper for the Disciples of Christ, Church of Christ, Churches of Christ, he did not think that Mrs. Holman, who was a member of the Fayetteville Disciples of Christ Church, should be even this political by lobbying the legislature for prohibition. But most preachers embraced the idea of temperance and were willing to preach from the pulpit that the dangers and the sin of alcohol and drinking. Mrs. Holman was very successful as president. The membership grew exponentially. They had a great success with the General Assembly as well. They were able in 1909 to get the Tennessee General Assembly to pass statewide prohibition some 10 years before national prohibition went into effect. Tennessee, I think, was the 7th or 8th state to grant nationwide, statewide prohibition. So Tennessee was completely dry long before the 18th Amendment was added to the Constitution. Selina Moore Holman was a very effective political organizer. She knew how to make her message simple. It is protection of the family, and this will be a benefit to every community in our state. Now, in the Northeast, women are organizing as well, and in the cities of Boston, New York, Philadelphia in particular. And we suddenly began to see women's clubs being organized, led by the Cirrhosis Club and Jenny Cunningham Crowley, who began promoting the idea of women forming clubs to better themselves, to better women who were professional writers, who wrote for newspapers, women who were at home and not working outside the home, but eager to learn. And so this women's club movement begins in the Northeast, but it quickly spreads to the South. And all of these organizations that you see here are all, there is sort of a parallel track of African American women, free African Americans, who some had been slaves, but some had been free before the Civil War. Particularly, Nashville had a substantial population of free blacks before the Civil War began. So here we've got women's clubs being founded, and women began reading and studying no matter what their educational level may be. So one of the Tennessee women who got into this very, very quickly was Lizzy Crozier French. She was a Knoxville woman. Her husband had died. They hadn't been married very long. She taught at a girls' school for many years, and she decided that the Knoxville women needed their own women's club. So she organizes the Ossory Circle in Knoxville. This is where it all began. And then she began to spread the word of women need to be in these organizations, learning how government works, learning about literature, all manner of things that they could do. So you see this club movement bursting forth across the state of Tennessee. In Memphis, it was the 19th Century Club. This club is still active in Memphis, and they have their headquarters in this very elegant house that was originally built by a gentleman who had made a fortune in the lumber business, and it had sold a couple of times when they bought this house in the 20s, and it is quite an elegant house there on Union Avenue in Memphis. Here is Mary Church Terrell. You may or may not have heard of her, but she definitely should be in all of the Tennessee history books, as well as other women of color who were very active in a variety of social, religious, and even political organizations. Mary Church was born in Memphis. Her father had been the son of a white man, and his mother had been the gentleman's slave. So he was born a slave, but his father, when he died, left him some money. So he is regarded, Robert Church Sr. is regarded as the South's first African-American millionaire. He educated his children well. Mary was sent to Oberlin College in Ohio. She married, spent most of her adult life in Washington, D.C., but she and a group of other women of color founded the National Association of Colored Women. It became a very prestigious and active group. They had a variety of departments, just like the other women's clubs had. They worked for political causes. Their motto was lifting as we climb, trying to uplift the race. The National Association of Colored Women had its national convention in Nashville in 1897, the year of the Centennial. They met primarily at the Howard Congregational Church here in Nashville and the Negro Pavilion in the Centennial Exposition. Mrs. Kirkman, the chair of the women's division, went to speak. She spoke to these women during the Centennial when they had their convention. But Mary Church Terrell really needs more recognition than she has received. Lots of other African American women were active in lots of different groups. The Phyllis Wheatley societies, African American sororities, African American church groups. Ida B. Wells from Memphis led a national and indeed an international campaign and organization to prevent lynching of African American men. Dwight Lewis, a couple of weeks ago, he's a retired editor of the Tennessean, had an op-ed piece about Ida B. Wells and the fact that she needs more prominence in our history book, as all of these African American women, and to a lesser degree, the white women need as well. So we've got club fever everywhere, and Nashville is no exception. The Quarry Club and the Review Club are founded to give women opportunities to learn. And they each present a paper at these regular meetings. You are to research your paper and give your paper. Certainly men had these kinds of organizations. The one that comes to mind here in Nashville of a male organization like this was and is the Old Oak Club. But these women came together, they studied a different topic. Now you can see that this idea of studying really filters on out to church groups and church women, because this is the point at which church women began missionary societies. They began studying other countries, other cultures, learning about the world, and raising money to send women and men out of the United States as missionaries. These were very successful. The YWCA movement does come to Tennessee, and Knoxville, Nashville, Chattanooga, and Memphis will all have a YWCA. They all operate in similar fashions. I know more about the Nashville YWCA than the other three, but they all eventually established a colored branch. This was their idea of good race relations, of creating a separate colored branch, as they call them, for African American women. African American women were not allowed to stay in these facilities, these residences, until the 1960s. Now here we go back to Kate Kirtland. I want to end with her since I began with her. She became the chair of the Women's Committee for the Centennial. She was an organizer. She brought women together, not just those on her board, but she planned programs so that women from across the state would come to see this magnificent women's building, see what women had accomplished there, and they would go back to Memphis or Knoxville or Chattanooga or Paris or Lebanon, Tennessee, or Humboldt, Tennessee, or Johnson City, Tennessee, and talk about what they had done and been inspired by what they had learned at the Centennial Exposition. Here is Sarah Ward Conley, whom the women picked to be the architect. Women ran every aspect of this except for the actual physical building of these buildings there. These buildings on the ground were grand to look at, but they were made out of something that was really quite temporary. It's been described to me as being almost like paper mache. And so they were not built to last. They were built for the exposition, and that was to be the end of their use and their lifespan. But wouldn't it have been grand to have visited this when the Centennial was going on? There you see the Women's Pavilion. Some of the women on the board enjoyed the work and thought it was so important, Elizabeth Rhodes Atchison Aiken being one of them, that they will decide to form a club for civic benefit that they're going to call the Centennial Club. Excuse me, after the Centennial has closed and a few years have passed. They saw interdependence among women, and they saw that interdependence was really important. Women are preparing for convocations, are preparing convocations for the presentation and discussion of interests vital to womanhood of the world. Help us in this great work, dear friends, and be sure in advance that we mean success. And so the Centennial Club was established in 1905. It has a variety of programs like these other groups. They were very interested in benefiting our state, our city, and the neighborhoods where people live. Many of these things, as you can clearly see, have political agendas. Cleaning up the streets, better country roads across the state, laws against letting your animals run at large. Remember, people kept cows because they needed the milk. You needed the city to come in and impose fines or do something about vacant lots. They had a political agenda. Some of these women certainly supported having the right to vote. Some of their early members were Kate Birch Warner, Ann Dallas Dudley, Maria Thompson Davies. Those women were suffragists. Kate Kirkman and others did not think women needed the right to vote. They felt that women had more influence, in fact, by not voting, and that voting would diminish women because voting was looked at as a dirty, filthy task. Politics were looked at as very dirty and filthy. And so these suffragists over and over again, led by Carrie, Chapman, Catt, had to say that we are nonpartisan. We are nonpartisan. The suffragists wanted to stay out of politics. The suffragists had a good bit of momentum going after they really got started around 1910, 1912 across the state. They had a national convention in Nashville in 1914 that was a great success, and in came World War I. The United States did not enter what was being called the Great War for more than 2 years after it began in Europe, but the women were watchful of what was going on with this war. It began in August of 1914. The United States entered in April of 1917. And in that period of time, the Tennessee women were really trying to get some kind of voting rights within the state of Tennessee. They began organizing suffrage parades here in Nashville, in Memphis, in Knoxville. There were great parades. Here in Nashville, they would march from the Capitol down to Centennial Park have a grand rally there, but everything stopped for the war effort. The war provided women many, many other opportunities, however, to organize in different ways. They were working on war work, as you see this young woman here with her Women and War Work book there. And so on this note, we will stop until next week, when you're going to have the pleasure of hearing my friend Beverly Bond, who teaches at the University of Memphis, give a lecture about African American women and women's rights. Thank you very much. Now, I think Miranda may have some questions for me from you, or Rachel may have the questions, I'm not sure, but I'm happy here in the time we have remaining to take a few questions.
Yes, and thank you so much, Dr. Bucy, for your wonderful presentation. We have had some questions come in from the audience, and I want to invite folks, if you do have questions, to use the chat feature and send to all panelists. I'll start with a question about the House of Industry. We had a guest who asked, could you talk more about that and where it was located?
Okay, the House of Industry was downtown in Nashville on the block that is now called Polk Place. It's right by the Sheraton, across the street from the Sheraton, where the original YWCA was. The House of Industry kept going until the 1880s and 90s, but they didn't have enough room, and they didn't have the right facilities that were needed for women from out of town to stay there. And so they gave their property to the YWCA, the women who founded the YWCA, in response to a letter that someone wrote to the Tennessean, a businesswoman who couldn't find a place to live. So they wrote that, and they were given that property. But it functioned for a very long time, as did the YW. But the YWCA did made a great decision in the late 70s to make that turn from closing the residential. Young women didn't need to be living in a dormitory with a curfew when they worked. They wanted an apartment. And so now they provide lots of domestic violence services, literacy services, and lots of other job training for women. There's the YWCA is still very much in existence.
Thank you. We've had another guest who asked about Selena Holman's views on women's suffrage.
Selena Holman wanted the right to vote, but many of her members did not. So much so that when the National Convention met here in 1909, she had to issue a press statement, because Frances Willard was very openly in favor of women's suffrage. She was very pro-suffrage. And so Selena Holman had to issue a statement that appeared in the newspapers that the organization in Tennessee had not endorsed women's suffrage, but she herself, she was quite a character. And I didn't give anybody my email. I didn't put an email address on a slide, as I should have, but I'm happy to take email inquiries. I can send you some, if you're interested in sources. Let me see if I can go over here to my PowerPoint, and I will send you some, I'll put my email address up here, and you can send me your, if you need sources for various things, I'll be happy to take your questions about I can't type and talk at the same time very well. Okay, now I think I've got this. I would be happy to hear from you by email. Oh, I've got to share the screen now, don't I? I've got to share my screen with you guys. So let me go back up here to screen share. Here it is. Now, can you see my email address there? Miranda, can you see it? Good. So I'm happy to, I saw some questions about sources, and Selena Holman is one of my particularly favorite women, but there are a lot of these women that are, it's like your children. You just can't play favorites with these Tennessee women. Other questions, Miranda?
Miranda, can you hear?
Oh, Miranda is muted.
Oh, I apologize. We have a question about, did the different women's groups in Tennessee communicate with each other, especially across the state?
Yes, that was what the Federation of Women's Clubs was all about. It was designed to provide communication with each other. And so, you know, fast forward to after women get the right to vote, the suffrage movement sort of split as to what the best strategy for women to go forward was, whether we needed protective legislation for women in the workplace or equal rights. Alice Paul's group founded the National Woman's Party, and the League of Women Voters had that position of, we need protective legislation to protect women in the workplace. Eleanor Roosevelt was a member of the League of Women Voters. And so one by one, if we go through the 40s and the 50s, and all of these organizations, the YWCA, the Federation of Business and Women's Clubs, all of these groups one by one are endorsing the Equal Rights Amendment. The League of Women Voters was actually one of the last groups to endorse the Equal Rights Amendment because they felt they were looking out for women in the workplace. But that's a different story for a different time. Other question?
We'll wrap up with this question.
Okay.
We had a guest who asked if Jackson had a chapter of the WCA, and who would also like to learn more about segregation within that organization.
Jackson, Tennessee, a WCTU or a suffrage association?
A YWCA.
Jackson, I'm not sure that Jackson had a YWCA. No, I really should look that up. That would be probably easy enough to figure out. But I don't think Jackson necessarily had a YWCA. Jackson, you know, today has 3 colleges: Union University, Lane College, and Jackson State Community College. But I don't think that they had a YWCA. I could be wrong about that, though. I'm sure that they had a lot of active women in Jackson because it was a pretty robust, it is a pretty robust city.
All right, Miranda and Carole, thank you so much for your time. And Carole, thank you for sharing your email. So if anybody, lots of people are saying, great job, Carole, thank you so much. If anybody had questions that are unanswered, thank you for letting them email you. We will be back next week with Dr. Beverly Bond. As Carole mentioned, she's going to talk about Civil War and Reconstruction, specifically African American women's groups, and how they lead into the suffrage movement. So that would be wonderful. You do have to register for that as a separate week, so make sure you register for her class. And have a great rest of your night. Thank you guys so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Carole. Thank you.
See you later.